Because at this stage everybody knows everybody else. You know all your foibles and quirks, and you know us, and you know your two speakers at this stage. This is going to be the most informal session you have had. We expect a lot of interaction. Ask us. If you like, certainly wait till the end and we can have a decent question and answer session afterwards, and I think we most certainly will do that. But if something is absolutely blocking you in the middle of the presentation, tell us, and certainly I'm going to try and answer straight away, and we'll get stuck into that. What I'm going to do is just tell you where we've taken the research into our own Galway families at this stage, and how that's looking and what we're going to get into in the near future. So I'm talking about the history side of things. Christy, on the other hand, he's just completed his PhD in archaeology. He knows what he's talking about, as you know, about monuments. So he'll be talking about the archaeology or the footprint that the Larkin families have left on this piece of earth since they've been striding around East Galway. And the Larkins have been striding around East Galway for more than 1,500 years, since about 500 AD, 495 thereabouts is what we're told. They were part of the kingdom of Portumna there, which you may have heard of, which was run by the Kellys. The Maddens run the southern portion of Portumna, and we were part of the Larkin Clan, and we provided olives and historians to that clan. That was our role in the Gaelic scheme of things, which, as I said, lasted for over 1,000 years. So it lasted from about 495 AD to 1585 AD. That's how long it was an independent kingdom. We basically had a fixed role for virtually all of that time, in virtually a fixed place. And my great ambition over the past number of years has been to find out where that place is, try and define it, and then look at the monuments that are in there and see whether we can claim those monuments as our own. And I think I've come a long way down that road. As I was saying to Christy, some 20 years ago, like everybody else, I thought the Larkins were basically tenant farmers, that we were peasants, if you like, and had been on the land and worked for many, many millennia. It looks as though we were something more than that. We were indeed. We did have a role in society, and that we had that role for a very long time, and in medieval times we're actually quite a prominent family. So that's something that we can look back on, I think, with a little bit of pride. And so, having made those assumptions, what we really now want to do is prove that. And you remember that yesterday in Clan Macnoise, we came across this stone, and as I told you, it's well known, Old Larkin. So he would have been the first of the Larkin people carved in stone, so to speak. And this is what led me to look for that stone. I only found this balloon. I only found that out in 2003, which is only 6 years ago. But reading through various literature, I was reading about the stones in Clan Macnoise, and I came across a couple of diagrams, and one of them, but this one was very, very early, and it didn't seem to mean much to me. But Borgan was seemed to be a very strange word, and I was wondering if that was right. And then I saw that one interpretation said that this was not Borgan, it was Larkin, which was very close to Larkin. So I did more studies in the literature, and I found this diagram here. And that was actually readable because R.A.S. McAllister, who was a very distinguished archaeologist, had read through this and had deciphered some of the inscription. He said, "For the one, Moel is Maelroin, Moelroin, it looks like a H-U, but that's the older way of writing Lorgain, or Lorgan. So our full name was there, and that got me very excited, and that's when I went off to Clan Macnoise to have a look. And the first thing, it was just incredible. You could recount it now and take any interpretation you wanted this, but I just went into Clan Macnoise, paid my €4, whatever it was at the time, walked straight up the hill, and I walked into St. Pierre's cell. The first thing I saw St. Pierre's cell was this stone. I went over the stone, and I said, that's it. And it was. And the way I proved it to myself was I had with me an acetate, a print, a transparent acetate, which is a print of McAllister's drawing with that inscription on it there. And remember the features we spoke about in it? They're come out very clearly on the acetate. There's the fleur de lis, which is down at the bottom. There are the two little feet that I often speak about, which represents the way these used to be stood up when people were preaching and telling the story of the stone. And there was the Lorcan, there's the marigold pattern in the centre as well, which is a great old symbol, which long predates Christianity, and very strong paneling in the cross. And everything was precisely, and when I went home and superimposed that acetate on the previous photograph, which saw the fish was precise, and there was no question but this was the stone. What astonished me about it was the position of the stone. It was inside St. Kieran's Valley, so it was clear it was intended to be there, and I have unearthed photographs of the 1950s when it was excavated by the OPW. There are photographs of that stone under the ground, which was under the floor inside McKinn's St. Kieran's. So it had been there for centuries. That was very, very clear and covered over. Sadly, they dug it up with the bulldozers at the time, or the digger, and broke the stone in half. So, but they have acknowledged it, and I was flattered and delighted to hear the guide tell us about McNoy's yesterday that now all of the tour guides there are aware that this is a Larkin stone, and will tell people who come there, this is the Larkin stone, it's inside here itself. I mean, it goes back at least to the 12th century. And so lovely, we've been added to the list of distinguished families or people that can be talked about with some respect.
That's amazing.
That's very, very nice. Yeah. So that is a nice outcome to that. So that's enough about that stone. That told me at this stage that I was onto something, and maybe the Larkins, as I said, were a bit more than pleasant farmers. So we need to go back to what Ireland looked like. This is 1535, this map is based on, and I don't know if you knew how many independent lordships or mini kingdoms there were in Ireland. There were 103 at the time, run by different families. You had Hymany up there, of which we were essentially a part, which was run by the Kellys, if you like. And you had the Burkes, the Van Rickard Burkes, that we were just looking at their houses and castles. All that piece there is theirs. But down here is what is now referred to later, I suppose, as the Barony of Longford. But this is where the Madden's house sway, and our role in the society, the Gaelic society at that time, was to be others to the Maddens. So we were the writers, we were the copyists of their books, we were their historians, and may well have been their doctors or other providers of expertise. And being an Olive was one of the highest levels you could attain. It was actually higher than being a bard, and it took something like 13 years of education to get to that.
So is it translation something directly in English?
Yes, professor is the normal translation. But that was our role. And if you look at the shape of that barony, you'll notice something. It juts into County Galway, it actually crosses the Shannon. And this little salient, if you like, is the only part of Connacht that ever crossed the Shannon. The rest of it is west of the Shannon, the west of Connacht. But this part across the Shannon down there, into Lusman, to County Galway, has been traditionally part of Connacht. When the English shired the country, as they said, in the late 16th century, they pulled that back and took that into Leinster and part of County Galway. But in fact, the church never recognised that, and the Catholic diocese of Clonfert still holds sway in that particular part of the country. And the reason for that is historic. It corresponds precisely to the old kingdom of Hymany. So when you look at the map of the diocese of Clonfert today, it is precisely the map of the kingdom of Hymany. That's the kingdom I told you lasted for over 1,000 years, from about 495 AD to 1585 AD. So that's something that is very, very interesting. Monia actually established in 457, a little earlier than I said, and his descendants were all of these fine people. There's Brazil, who's the ancestor of all the Donaldons, so you hear of Clan Brazil, that's where they come into it. Dallon, Louis, Fardock, Carver Crum, who's very, very famous indeed, and then Cormac, equally famous. Two sons, one of them called Owen Fionn and one called Owen Wood. Owen Fionn means John the Fair, Owen the Fair, so he must, we presume, have been blind. But he's the ancestor of the Kellys. And Owen Wood, who was flourishing in 624 AD, was the ancestor of the Maddens and the Larkins and that group of family in southern Hymany, where we occupied and did for such a long time. I'm not going to go down through them all, but they are very interesting. This is Owen Fionn again, and that's his descent down to Ceallaich, who flourished in 874 AD. And as I said, Ceallaich, from Ceallaich comes Kelly, and from Kelly, all the Kelly families originated. Owen Buach, then, whom I mentioned, had a son, Ancha, who was Ambrose, that's generally translated. And he had several sons. One of them was Dungla, from whom the Donnellys all descended. There's Maladun, from whom the Munduns are said to have come. There's Coffach, who flourished in 720 AD, from whom the Coffees are all descended. There's Dunaduck, from whom the Downies have come from. There's Gaira, from whom some of the O'Garras have come from. Dunaduck again, another grandson of this man there, who flourished in 953, Girard. And then Madagon Moore, who is the ancestor of all the Madden families in this region. On the other side then, Owen Buach, by the way, means Owen the Tawny. The Buach is the old word for bui, which is the current modern Irish word for yellow. So we can use a yellow-faced person, and it's the name that's generally given to somebody who's had jaundice. So he may have had an infected sword wound or something at some stage in his life, but clearly we know a little bit about his history. He had jaundice. And his eldest son was Furbasa, which is Furzy in English, and the school I went to as a child, my first school was Scotland, which was a nice neat connection there. And he had all these different people here until you get down to Moran, and Moran had a son called Lorcan, and he's the first of the name in this part of the world. Further down then you have Muinter, who is believed to be the progenitor of the Moonies with the Doom, whose castles were passed on the court yesterday. And then Cosgrave, who is the progenitor of the Cosgrave families, and so on, down to the Connachtons here, who's the Connaughton families, who are also Alpha. So that's where all of those families come from, where they all fit together. So that's more than likely, that's the documented descent that we have, or the nearest that we have to it. So what to do with all that information? That's as much as I could get from O'Donovan, the reading of the Urban Survey records and these things. So I started looking further afield for some information. And this sounds like something very morbid. It's not. There was this wonderful society that went around at the turn of the previous century. It's the Association for the Preservation of the Memorials of the Dead in Ireland. And it's a consolidated of surnames and place names. They went through all the family names and they recorded all the gravestones that grew in different parts of Ireland. And they came up with all the people who were buried and had the dates, and they have the sons and the daughters and the wives and the husbands, and all of these listed. And it's a wonderfully useful thing. So I spent many happy hours in the National Library, and I was working in Dublin, and I used to pop over every Tuesday night and have a look at what was there. But one of the things that jumped out at me here was this Mealy Abbey. And you know that I had never heard of Mealy before at the time that I first came across this. I actually didn't know what Mealy was, to my eternal shame, because it's now such a huge part of my life that I'm astonished I didn't read it before. So this gave me another lead, and he said it's from the Book of Mealy, 1474. So, oh my God, it's the Book of Mealy, you know? I said I better find out something about this and chase this up. And so I did, went away he would. And there's me, there's the church I found, and I found, Christy mentioned actually, the permission to build this was given by the Empty Globe in 1414. I don't think it was actually physically constructed until 1475, but I'm quite sure that question. Yeah, there are questions about that, but they say the doors was built in 1414, so who knows, maybe it was. But that's the church there. It is that old, it is 15th century, so it's an absolutely wonderful church, a lovely place to visit. And references were made in the various documents that came out here to a Larkin chapel and stuff like this. This is a picture that you know where that came from. But it's an old one for the most recent restoration inside the church. But it's a lovely atmospheric place. You'll have the opportunity to see it tomorrow one way or the other, we expect. And it's a place you should not miss. Anyone who is a Larkin really cannot fail to be moved, Julie, I think, by walking around a place of this kind. And we discovered that one of the people who was writing down all these documents for this book in Mealy, this is a picture, this is a sort of a generic picture of the copyist, is what that is called, and it's a medieval monk who's copying one whole parchment to another. And that's what a lot of these places do, and that's how all our records are preserved. And that's how these records of all the Larkins were preserved by people like that. But to my astonishment, the guy who was doing all the writing in Mealy was one John Larkin, Johannes Larkin. So he was John Larkin, and I was thrilled to hear this. So I put together what I could find in the various references to the memorials of the dead to do with the Larkins. And there were quite a lot. And some of them looked very distinguished. And for example, here you had Mary Lawrence, who was one of the Lawrences of Lawrencetown, because she was the daughter of Walter Lawrence, who established Lawrencetown. And she was the daughter of Evelina Donlan, who was the O'Donnell, who was the chief of the Donlan family, and she was wife of Bernard Lorcan. Fabulous, this is great stuff. So we'll go on with this, and then we went down to all the various different people down here, and there's Roger Larkin and all these Larkins, and they were all very distinct. Lots of, look at the numbers, they were guardians of Mealy Convent at the time, so they had a real place in society. And another reference is here to Bernard Lorcan, for example, that man we mentioned there. is buried in the chapel of his ancestors. And there you have, buried in the sepulchre of the chapel of his ancestors, that was Master Bernard Lorcan, who was a school teacher, the master in this case, he was a teacher. He actually, this is the H school master, and he taught Greek, and the Egan man taught, they wandered around from school to school when there were no Irish schools. This is how they did it. And then you have there's a son, two sons of the same Bernard Lorcan, who went into the convent and became Franciscans there. There's also a daughter there called Sheila Lorcan. And again, she was the daughter of Bernard Lorcan and Mary Lawrence, and she was a pious nun and entered the family there. And further down we have Roger Larkin, who was actually Captain Larkin, and he took on the Jacobite cause. He was a Tory, of course, but he's documented as Roger. That's basically the way things were done at the time. Official records tend to be either Latin or Anglicised, but that was, so he was espoused the Jacobite cause and looked after all of that. But for later on in his life, he was found to have sponsored, I suppose, or funded or looked after the rebuilding of a portion of the Larkin Chapel, which was attached to the main church. So that big church we saw there was actually patronised by the O'Malley's, and we have the primary chapel attached to it that was established and funded by the Larkin family, who clearly must have had the wealth of places. It's pointless me going down to those one by one. I'll just deal with the salient points that jump out as we move along, but I will be making these available in due course. I mentioned Bernard, of course, is a very significant person to us. And I'll just read what we put together on him, and you can just see the kind of pedigree we're talking about for this man. Bernard Lorcan of Kiltormer and his family were very important to that parish. He was married to Mary, the daughter of Walter Lawrence of Billimore, which is Lawrencetown, by Walter's wife, Euclid Donnellan, sister of Sir James Donnellan, the Donnellan of Alabama. So her brother was the chief of the Donnellan family, so he was quite a man. He was Chief Justice of Connaught in 1637, and she, this Evelina Donnellan, was daughter of the Reverend Nehemiah Donnellan, who was Archbishop of Tuam, who was Tuam myself and Mary saw in Tuam with the people not so very, very long ago. By his wife, Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Nicholas, the chief of the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell. Bernard and Mary had a daughter called Sheila, who became a nun in the immediate convent in 1682, but died a couple of years later, and she was described as a pious virgin and very devoted to the convent. They had two sons who also became Franciscans. Brother Bernard Lorcan, born in 1664, and they received the provision of court in 1682, and his brother John Lorcan, who was born in 1662, and both of those took the court of St. Francis in 1682 from the Reverend Father Thaddeus Lorcan, another relation who was guardian of the monastery. This very Reverend Father John Lorcan was guardian of Mealy. He died in 1755 at the age of 93 and was buried in Lorcan's tomb. And this man is incredibly important to us. When he was about 20 years of age, he went to Louvain, and I read the book of Louvain, the Libris Louvainiensis, and he is mentioned in this because he became a professor of divinity in Louvain, and he taught there for many years. He taught there for over 15 years. And in 15 years he was summoned to Rome, and he was served on an inquisition in Rome, which inquired into the state of Protestantism in Ireland. And they were worried about the number of priests that were being proselytized and converted to Protestantism. And he was asked to investigate that, and that was his particular task in Rome. So in due course that took its time, and eventually we have a copy of a letter from the Father Provincial, who was the headman of the entire Franciscan order, instructing him to return to Ireland and to preach to the locals. So in the middle of the penal laws, when it was a priest who would be found wandering anywhere in the countryside would be basically killed or interned at best, he actually came back to his own people, worked in the monastery of Mealy and administered to them there, and he is the man who took it upon himself to write off the chronicles of Mealy. In a few moments I'll show you his handwriting and what he wrote about it and what he said about it, and you'll see exactly the kind of job he did. And what an amazing man, what an astonishing career. He died 1755 at the age of 93, and he was buried in Larkin's tomb, in the Larkin tomb at Mealy. So that's a wonderful bit of history there. Bernard himself died in March 1683, but his will was not proven until March 1717 because of the state of disturbance of the country at the time. But he left his estate to his children, Donna, Roger, Duggan, John, Brian Augustine, Wayne Rowan, Andrew, and Sheila. And one of the things I thought was so beautiful here was Wayne Rowan. It's just beautiful. That name is carried forward from time like now. It appears, I found relatives before him who were also named Wayne Rowan, but I haven't found any after him. But there's Wayne Rowan, obviously flourishing in the 18th century, carrying that wonderful name that's been in the family for over 1,000 years. So there's a bit of history there. I then became aware that there was a gentleman in Dublin called to publish the Chronicles of the Meath, because I had found fragments here and there, but I'd never seen the whole lot together. So I made contact with this man, who is an absolutely wonderful man and an extremely distinguished and highly thought of author. He's Father Ignatius Fennessy. He's a Franciscan priest. He's 84 at the time. An absolutely wonderful man, and we became quite friendly, and we exchanged an awful lot of emails talking about the meaning of names and the Irish rendition and the English rendition, quite a lot of this. And last year, finally, he published the whole Chronicle of Meath. But in the meantime, I was very privileged to come sufficiently into his confidence that he invited me to come and have a look at it. And he operates the Franciscan Library in Killiney in Dublin. This is the entrance to that. On very unprepossessed, you wouldn't think there was very much there. But I mean, this is where the books that were brought back from Louvain during the Second World War, they were afraid that Louvain was going to be bombed during the Second World War. They brought the books back to Dublin and they housed them out of Killiney there. So we have all these ancient records that were taken out of the country for safekeeping in the 17th century. They were returned in the middle of the 20th century, again, to keep them safe. And this was the repository for all of those wonderful books. And our own Chronicles of Meath were in that book. That's a small corner of the library. I just love it because it's so atmospheric. It's a lovely place. If anyone should ever have the privilege of being asked to go there, please do. This is the front cover of the Book of Meath. Now, the history of the times is such that you have to take into account that it's in a desperate condition. And the reason this is so is because a lot of it was written and saved during the times of the penal law. The friars were actually driven out of the convent for much of the 18th century, and they lived in marshland around the circumference of the area. They hid in Friars Island and various other places that now carry the names that were given to them at the time. And they were harried from pillar to post, so they were always in hiding and never had to take a place to live, and never had houses to live. But they carried with them the Chronicles of Meath, this stunning and beautiful book. Green vellum, and it's bound in very thin wool leaf, which has been very valuable and very scarce at the time. And as we see, some of it is actually worn off already, and this is very, very faded, and there's water damage, and the binding internally is beginning to show through. But that's a photograph of the actual book. This is not a copy. It's the size of my laptop, a little bigger than an A4 page. So that's the book. That's what it looks like. This is what the front page, which is the preface of the book. That's how it looks like. Again, a lot of water damage. This is John's handwriting. This is not a copy. This is not a reproduction. This is a photograph of John's handwriting. This is how he put down the history of Meath. And this talks about it being established, as we said, in the year 1474. And he gives the whole background to it there. And I have a translation of that page because I don't want to bore you by going through line by line. And anyway, this is easy to read. I'll just read the first paragraph. The friar in the name of the Lord, amen, is how he starts it off. And the friary of Meath, in the diocese of Muinter in County Galway, was founded for the observance itself, referring to his own order, in the year 1474. Others think it's much older, about 1300. For its founder, it had larger land. It was suppressed and nearly totally destroyed in the time of Queen Elizabeth by the inhabitants themselves and the Catholics, to prevent it becoming a fortress of heretics to the ruination of the fatherland. So you've got this wonderful flowery language of the time, and it's justifying what happened. And they actually unroofed it themselves, lest the Cromwellian army and the Williamite army should come along and complete the destruction themselves. And if they saw the roof off, they did leave it alone. So obviously that is the intention there. So I'm not going on. The rest of it is just about the order itself and the way it's organised and the different conventional meetings that every year. This is John's signature. It's absolutely beautiful. And you can see he made mistakes. I mean, he crossed them out and put in the better words or more improved words, and he crossed out things he didn't like. But he did this lovely flowing hand, quite a nice hand. And this was written in 1726 when he was quite aged. He was a bit like Father Fennessy in Dublin at the time, quite aged at the time. But it's very human. It's just beautiful, right? I mean, he made mistakes. He was a great scholar. This man was a professor of divinity. He was the confidant of the Pope. He had served all over the place and come back to Ireland to look after, to minister to his own people in their appalling hour of need during the penal laws when it was illegal to be a Catholic. Horrifying. What a wonderful thing he did. And he wrote down on this something very moving. You know? And he said, "These fragments of olden times concerning our friar me, which I have found dispersed, mixed up, and not edited. For the sake of future readers, I have put into a better order, which could not be done without another book." And it's signed Friar John Larkin, 1726. That's his own hand. I think
that's some understanding. Couldn't be done without much work.
exactly. It is an understatement, isn't it? Yeah, it's beautiful. So amongst a small number of quotes I'm going to give you out of here, and this is one of them which is very important to us, obviously a few families here, but it is, there's a lot of pedigree in this small sentence here, which is very, very good to see. On this day, the 6th of December, 1675, Mrs. Mary Lawrence, the daughter of Walter Lawrence of Middlemore and Eveline Donnellan, the wife of Brian Lorcan, he's referring to Mary was the wife of Brian Lorcan, departed from this life. She's buried in the burial place of the said Brian Lorcan. She left a legacy to this priory, may she rest in peace. Amen. So there it is, very, very simply. He just brought Walter Lawrence first, and then he went, "Ooh, anymore," you know, just put it in there just in case they thought it was some other Walter Lawrence. It's just absolutely beautiful. And here he is just running along here. Oh, God, I've put in the ears. There it is. And, you know, it shortens the Domina Maria Lawrence, so it just shows DNA, which is a fabulous way of shortening it. So that's a bit and crossing the D's and all kinds of stuff. It's beautiful writing. Very, very nice. So that's what he wrote there about Mary Lawrence. And then you get towards the end of the book and you found that it was used for lots, obviously, of births, marriages and deaths. And coming to the end of the book, then you find that it's dying down because there's only 3 friars left in the monastery, then there's only 2 friars left in the monastery, and then there's only 1. And they start recording day-to-day trivia because there's not much else going on in the place. And you find that about 1840, just shortly before Father Reynolds left, you find that they were putting down a record of their expenditure. And then this says, "True ploughing for 3 days, 15 shillings. So that's what it cost for 3 days. And depending on your frame of mind, to 18 bees it could be, or it could be to 18 beers, I don't know which, 2 shillings and 6pence. Now given that he's a Larkin, it might well have been the beers, but it could be bees. You know, let's assume they were making honey with it, okay? And the next one, to 50 pounds of sugar with 2 G's, 3 shillings and trebles. To a cow, 2 shillings and 6pence. To a quarter of mutton, 14 pounds at 9pence a pound. And finally, to a quarter of bacon at 9 3/4 pence each.
Sounds like a good time.
Yeah, so that's what they bought on that particular day towards the end of it. At that stage, that is the last entry by a friar. After that, then, it is signed at the very, very back in quite a modern print by Father James Hines, PPCC. So you know the friars are no longer there. And he was PP in that area from 1853 to 1862. So this dates to about 1855. Is that date? He signed that. That's the last page there. He took it away, and it eventually, after a few generations, it took a long, long time for Francis to get this back in the second years. And there were fragments of it copied here, there, and everywhere, as I was saying. But eventually, it wound up with the library of the Francis. So there it is there, and that's what we found out about the book of Mealy. And I was able to go the whole thing from cover to cover. There's the back cover, there's the binding again, and the whole thing, as I was saying, clearly very, very damaged due to its time and storage. But it is the original, it's in the old handwriting, it's all there, and a lot of history from the 16th century down to the mid-19th century is recorded there, and every Larkin virtually who went to the door of Meath is recorded in that. So it's an absolutely fantastic family treasure for us. So where to go next? That took me, as I said, from the late 16th, early 17th century. And I said, okay, well, who's before them and what did they do and did it come to anybody's attention? So I went to the fiants. Now the word fiant comes from fiant literary patentes. It just means letters patent to be made. And that's where the Tudors excelled. They made records of absolutely everything. So the fiants are there. And that's what that word means. So let's look at the fiants. This is what they look like. This one is just the appendix. 1575 is the year. These are the fiants of Elizabeth, who was the queen at the time. And amongst the most interesting people that are mentioned in this particular one was a wonderfully named Patrick Muinter Lorcan of Ballynahinch, a horseman in the county of Tipperary, who was pardoned for his crimes upon payment of a small fine. And that was in the 20th of August, 1575. So you get this kind of references to people. So these are great. So I said, let's look at all our references. In fact, I've noted down all the references for all the Larkins throughout the whole country. But today I just want to give you the Galway ones because clearly they're very interesting to us. We're in Galway. So these are the different people. And we see that in 1570, on the 22nd of March, we had Larkin Lorcan of Moy, who was a cairn. A cairn is just a foot soldier, an infantryman, if you like. And he was pardoned upon a fine of 14 good cows to the President of Connacht. So he fined 14 good cows and donated those to the President and he was given a certificate of pardon. And whether he was forgotten about or not is a different matter, but he was pardoned. Now 14 good cows would do a pretty decent fine at the time, I think. So we don't know what he did, but it must have been pretty nice. 8th of February 1585, we have Dungan Rowe Lorcan of Lissyregan was pardoned. There's no fine mentioned, he was just pardoned straight. Dungan Rowe. Now Dungan is really interesting because Bernard had his son Dungan as well. And so the correlation is there that maybe that's been carried down through the family. It's also interesting because it tells us that he inhabited Lissyregan at the time. And that was 1585. A little later on, 17th of May, the same year, we have Shane O'Rourke of Kilcartet. Just remember we mentioned that one. It's east of Lissyregan. I think it's 2 townlands east from Lissyregan. Lissyregan is Ballymore, which is Lawrencetown. I should explain to everybody just know where it is. I'll show you on that momentarily. He was and then H. O'Rourke was the next one of Crockwell, which is another local townland there. And again, we'll show you where all these townlands are and how they fit together. He was pardoned upon payment of a £20 fine. Now, a £20 fine was a big fine, I would have said at the time, but a pound was a large sum of money at the time, so £20 was massive. It's a very big fine. So he must have been considered to have done something really massive. And even though he's described just as a cottier, isn't that interesting? So he wasn't an aristocrat, he wasn't a noble man, he was just a cottier. In May, later in May, in the same month, we have William Ogle Lorcan of Lisdowan, which is a town just south of Galway. Usually described as a gentleman. Now, a gentleman is not just a flattering term as it is today. A gentleman means that he was somebody who was able to rest on his laurels and didn't have to work because he owned a lot of land and he would have the cottiers like Asia working for him. And that's really the significance of that. So he's considered minor nobility, basically, is what that designation means. Next one down is Mulroney Ogle Lorcan, also of Lisdowan, who was a cairn. So there's our name is popping up again, remember we said to carry that from Clonmacnoise. Mulroney Ogle Lorcan, also of Lisdowan, also who was a cairn, another infantryman. Further down, Larkin of County of Galway, again, another cairn, another infantryman. These guys all being pardoned. They were pardoned upon a fine of 3 shillings and 4pence each. So these are minor, relatively minor misdemeanors, as against the guys who had to pay £20 each. So going down then, we're into 1585, still we're in June now, and we're at Larkin of County Galway, pardoned upon a fine of £6, 6 shillings and 8pence. So that was, he was obviously older than these guys, so it was 10 times as much reparation to make. 1585 in June, Muinter Lorcan, who was a freeholder in this dog, a freeholder, very interesting, so he wasn't subjected to anybody else, it was his land basically. 1585 we're talking about. Pardoned upon a fine of 6 shillings and 8pence. And finally, we find, this is actually part of the whole surrender and re-granting, heard reference to that, we were talking about it actually this morning in Portumna Castle, for surrender and regrant. As part of that surrender and regrant, in 1585, our clan, Muinter Lorcan, this is how the Elizabethans spelled it, Muinter Lorcan. All the lands and heritages in Shilanica, as part of the nation of O'Madden of Longford, granted to be held forever by the service of 1 knight's fee for a rental of 80 pounds a year, and to provide 6 horsemen and 24 footmen to the service of the President of Connacht or our deputy should they be passing through the territory. So if they were passing through the territory, we were obliged to provide guardsmen for them to issue their safety. So that was part of the deed. So the entire clan basically were pardoned in 1585 on the basis of the surrender and regrant of this privilege. So they all got their lovely piece of paper, you know, and basically the Irish at this stage, I should say, were falling around and rolling, laughing at the whole idea of giving pardons to hold their own land. And because ownership, we don't actually have a word in Irish to say I own something. This is my watch, of course, we can say that in English, but there is no way to say that in Irish. What we say in Irish is it's lumsa here, and what that says, it rests with me. The idea of possession simply wasn't in the Irish psyche at the time. So this whole idea of signing pieces of paper was totally meaningless. And it had them rolling around the floor, laughing the idea that you could pass on from one person to another. You could operate there, you could freely operate there, but the idea of actually owning a piece of land and passing it on to somebody else for money was just laughable. And they did laugh at it, and they signed these things willy-nilly without ever meaning a word of it. So they got the reputation of never being able to honour a contract. But in fact, they just didn't have it in their sight to do so. And finally, the last reference I found was 1586, 10th of June, William Lorcan, Kenneth Lisbon, pardoned. And at this stage, they were all described as being in the county of Connacht, because at that time the shiring of the place had not yet been complete. So there were the pardons in the Elizabethan period. And if we go down some 50, 70 years later and we look at the confiscations that took place, this is where it gets awfully interesting. Roger Mulroney O'Larkin in Raheen, which is just south of Crockwell, had his lands, had 41 acres of his land confiscated. What looks like the same man in Annacallo had 42 acres confiscated. Roger Mulroney O'Larkin. Rory MacDongan O'Larkin, so first cousin very likely. Remember Dungan O'Larkin, who was pardoned previously? He had 76 acres of land taken from him in Dangan, which in Dangan was Kennegeek, it's the same place. This is the old name, and in fact the Book of Survey and Distributions do state that this is Kennegeek, which is the next parcel of land to this region. Rory MacDougall O'Larkin, same man again in Lissy Regan at 133 acres. So there's a pattern that we can emerge here. The people who were pardoned either had their lands confiscated in the next confiscation on their own, or else their sons had. So you have Duncan got a pardon, but Rory had his land confiscated. Roger got a pardon up here, but Mulroney had got the pardon previously. Sorry, Mulroney got the pardon, but Rory had lands confiscated in Annacallo later. And so it goes. Down here, Rory Mulroney Larkin again, 66 acres in that's field. It was given in the book as chair or chunk, but it's not, it's directed, it's field. And Roger again, it doesn't say whose Roger this is, 362 acres in Crockwell. That actually represents more than 50% of that particular townland, which means basically it was his townland. And basically they've taken it all off him. So Rory MacDonald and Larkin then from Dublin, which is the same as Dangan, which is the same as Kennegeek, that little townland there, another 30 acres down that bit. And then those that receive land, and it's very interesting that they're not named up here and they're not named in the pardons, so they were never implicated in any rebellious activity. But not alone that, this symbol here indicates that they were given a certificate of innocence. That is to say, they were absolved of ever having committed a crime. But nonetheless, of course, their lands were taken off them and they were transplanted. They were transplanted from Kilformer, as all we know, to Clonkeene, and he was into the parish of Killalogen, where the land was taken off the Kellys and given to the Larkins in Killalogen. And Augustin Larkin and 7 others were transplanted to the Earl's land down in Annabay, which is north of near Aspen. That's where that is. So interestingly enough, these guys got their certificates of innocence. None of these did. These were all the sons of rebels. Their lands were taken off them. They got no recompense, and they got no lands given in reparation for the confiscation. Unlike these, who were declared to be innocent and therefore got lands given to them by way of compensation. Of course, they were taken off the lovely, prosperous, fertile hill and put into a desperate marshy bog instead. And the whole purpose, of course, was to move them out of whatever homelands they had. So that's what happened at that particular time. We're talking 1652 is when all this took place. Between 1552 and 1560, or that 10 years period. So the people who got the land are given us this. Brian Larkin, which is Bernard Larkin, which is one of the same Bernard Larkin we were looking at before, who endowed the convent of Mealy. First man married to Mary Lawrence, had the son John, who wrote the Chronicles of Mealy. This is him from Dangan, which is Scandia, as we said, and he was moved to the next barony. So he was taken out of Longford and moved to Clonmacnown. It just was only 6 or 7 miles as it happened. But as I said, he came off a lovely prosperous hillside where he was king of the hill and moved to Gilalaton where he was living in a marsh for many years as with his offspring. Nehemias then, let's not state what his original address was, so I can't be quite certain about that, but he wound up in the Barony of Leitrim and Clonmacnown of the Minor. So there are a lot of Larkins in that area that really owe their origins to this particular man, to that particular transplantation. And then Gilmore, alias Nehemias. And this is not him because this is not the same man as here. This man, he was in the custody of his guardian, John Pierce. Interesting name. John may or may not have been a priest, I suspect he may have been a priest. But he's guardian of John Pierce. He was in the custody of this man when this transplantation was moved. So he was taken out of Portumna again in the Barony of Longford and moved to Kilkenny. And finally then with Dorothy Larkin, who came out of Tipperary, but she was the widow of Larkin from Galway, and she was settled in Clorn and given 70 acres there. So they're the people who received land. And of course they were totally innocent and never have done anything wrong. But then I'm just showing you now, because we were talking about wild geese and it's significant what's going on, there are a couple of references to wild geese that were frozen. There aren't an awful lot. But there are these two anyway. Michael Larkin of Portumna, County Galway, born in 1689, enlisted in the French Army 23rd June 1716 at the age of 27. 1.71 metres tall, grey hair, blonde wig, and he worked in Francis Nugent's troops, which was formerly retired. And he died 48 in 1737.
What the key details that you've got blonde wig?
These are the details that were reported.
Yeah.
That's very real. I didn't select them, but that's what they thought were important at the time.
Yeah, because it costs money to get a ring.
Yeah. Well, only officers had wigs.
So 1.71 metres, that's about 5'9", is it? 5'9"?
It's under 6 foot. Yeah, just under 6 foot. There's another man, Dennis Lorcan of Carnini, County Galway, who was born in 1659, a lot earlier. He joined an Irish infantry regiment, which is probably Dillon's, in 1678, actually before the Battle of Larkin and that, but after the Cromwell War, so he was quite a right frame of mind. He was 10 years an ensign in Galloway's infantry, 2 years in the John Darnine Co-op, 7 years as a cornet in Sully's infantry, and 36 years in the cavalry from 1697 to 1733. He was admitted to the hospice where wounded soldiers were kept in Paris on 17th September 1733 by a lieutenant, and he died on the 21st of November 1735 at the ripe old age of 46. He spent so much time in the French army. Wonderful story. There are Larkins in Parry North today who appear to be descended from this man. So it's very interesting. If you look up the birds, they're concentrated in that area, and they appear to be his offspring. Back to our map again, and little bits and pieces here. I'll just remind you here of where we are in that part of the world, down the Barony of Longford, and down all of that area of ours in the middle there, because I'm going to show you what some of the compounds look like. We mentioned Dangan or Skenagita, and one of the Skenagita is spent like that. 123 acres there, a lot of it confiscated, a lot of it ploughed over later by the Mans when they set up the gardening operation there. So a lot has been destroyed, but there's a very, very large ring forest there. This is the 1840 map, and if you look around the edges here, you see that there are trees planted around the edge, and there, interestingly enough, There are also a row of trees on the inside as well, which is an amazing detail on that particular map. And that's what that feature looks like today. It's up on the crest of the hill, there's a beautiful gentle rise up to it, and you have this running all the way around here, and you have this outer ring of trees, and then you have these beautiful plain trees on the inside, the inner ring of trees, that goes to walk in the back there. And Larkins used to live there, you can take that as a given, that's where some of our Larkins live. That's what that looks like. This is Crockwell, the townland of Crockwell, and you saw Roger Maroney had 326 acres here, around taken off from here, which is about half of that townland. So he was a huge landowner in that area. And there are some lovely features in this particular place, including this down here, where there's a very, very large circular structure of some kind, shown there. And there's this oblong one down there, which Christian and I investigated recently, which is surrounded by what looks like a Bronze Age ditching around it. It's really very, very old. Long predates the Normans or the English in person into Ireland. But obviously our folks have been there for a very, very long time. And a big ring fort here we did with that as well. Just show you very quickly a single shot of what that looks like. There it is up on the hill again. Very clearly defined. There's the wall coming around there and all the way around there as well. And we heard from a local farmer, the local landowner actually owns that now, but it was excavated a few years ago, not for archaeological purposes, but to recover the sand. Because these were draining, because it was the top of the hill, they were filled in with sand, and they self-drain and stuff, which are lovely dry places like that. And so it was inhabited, and the big distinguishing feature of this is that it's enormous. It's a very, very big thing. But it is immediately adjacent to this one, and the two rings actually adjoin one another, and they're both protected by this, looks like an outer wall that makes it a hillside fort that's been there from time immemorial. And that's what the inside looks like. As I said, it was excavated, which you can clearly see the wall going around there, that goes right around. There's the hollow down the middle where the sand is scooped out for building purposes. And our folks live there. And there's a stone. Might or might not mean anything to us, as we said, but certainly it's at least a handhold. But also, I mean, there's the fish's tail, and here's possibly a fish's tail. We don't know. We can't say whether it has any significance or not. That's what it looks like. And finally, the last one of these townlands we mentioned Ballymore, or this region. So this is the big one. It's the most important one because it's where the Lawrence's built their house. Lawrencetown, the village is just up here. The town of Lawrencetown. The airport is down here. Portumna is up here. So that's the part of the world that is. Skengreen is up there. This is Crockwell running down here, and this is Anacalla running down here. So I hope you see the pattern that's emerging here. All these townlands we've been talking about are all adjacent to one another.
And where's Portumna in relation to
Portumna down here. Right down here.
Is that the right in there? In the
No, Athenry is way up here. That came later. And Athenry and all these other outlying areas like Dunary and the places we mentioned are as a result of the dispersion that was brought about by those transplantations. They were all together in one place up to 1652. This is the whole point of this. We actually have homeland in the immediate vicinity. But I just want to show you something very exciting that Christy and I can't wait to get to again. We found there is on the urban survey map a motion site. And this is a representation of what the motion site looks like. Now, it is said that if we couldn't afford to buy a castle, we would build a motion site. So only the very highest ranking people would have a motion site. And there was a big, big ditch for the village around the outside. They would be very, very large, 60 metres in each direction was the usual size of those. This would be filled with water, and you might or might not have a drawbridge, which would certainly have to protect an entrance into the area. And you have a number of long houses where people lived inside, and it was safe to enter back there and everything else. There is one on what was Larkin in this region, and there's reason to believe that it was ours for a hell of a long time. It may well have been an Anglo-Norman